Hello, welcome. Now, if you didn't know, this event, Unleash the Beast Writing and Wellbeing Symposium in Toowoomba, is the largest for World Mental Health Day, which is today, across Australia. And if you're in the audience, either digitally or in person, you can of course continue to join the conversation with the hashtag Unleash the Beast Symposium. So if you're tweeting here, just or Unleash the Beast Symposium. I've already started it, haven't I? Taken a selfie with the three here. But you can continue that conversation. You'll see this digital piece as well online a little bit later. If you're watching it digitally later, it will be fabulous because it'll go across the world that way. This conversation is meant to be relaxed, it's meant to be open, and I've been told no questions in terms of mental health are off limits. So it will be a relaxed, open conversation. You can ask questions at the end, so save them up if you have any. And but just remember, when you do ask questions, it's not necessarily a time for you to tell us about your world, rather ask the questions of the panellists. Otherwise, we'll run into the next time slot and the next panellist will get very anxious, and we don't want that. Oh, well, Mental Health Day, do we? The panel is called Northwest and Crooked, what really are the effects of mental health issues in the bush. Now, I'm going to let the panellists really introduce themselves in some ways. Firstly, I'm your host. I've been a journalist, it makes me sound very old. Well, a journalist of sorts, depends on what you call all the different roles I've done, since 1991. I worked in all mediums, newspaper, radio, television, and now online as well. Both in commercial land, I worked for a commercial newspaper, Channel 7, before I moved to the ABC. I have moved a lot, I have to say. I think in this game you have to move a lot. Initially I did anyway. And when it comes to issues in the bush, it's probably not that different to each of the regional cities that I've moved to. Some mostly in Queensland, but also in Tasmania as well. I have been and I am an on-air producer, an on-air journalist. I've worked behind the scenes, chief of staff, producer, journalist, field reporter, whatever you need at that time. I've covered several droughts, several floods, and of course the impact seems to be felt deepest in the bush. Farmers do have this image of resilience, and it's not an easy way to make a living. But they have this persona, I think, of being tough and able to cope with just about anything. I wonder whether that's really the reality, which is what we'll be talking about today. Suicide rates in rural areas are consistently 40% higher than the rates in metropolitan areas, for example. That's according to Sane Australia. Now, I would assume part of the problem is isolation. Farmers are less able to socialise because, if you think about it, dozens of workers and potential friends have been replaced by machinery over the years. Farms have grown in size simply to make things more sustainable. So while I have some idea of the potential issues, I cover topics like this all the time. The answers are, of course, a lot harder than the questions, aren't they? Georgie Somerset is a rural industry leader. She runs a cattle business, so she's placed pretty well to talk about this topic. Georgie, tell me a little bit more about yourself.
Thanks, Belinda, and great to have the crew here and those that watch later on. So I've got a cattle property a couple of hours west of Toowoomba, and it's about an hour from any town. There are a couple of smaller settlements that are about 40 minutes, but essentially our community is what it is without any town. So even though we're only 4 hours from Brisbane, it is actually reasonably isolated. But I've lived there for 30 years now. And lived most of my life, apart from a couple of years where I dallied with the city, in regional communities or on the land. So
before you moved there, would you describe yourself as a rural person or a city person?
Yeah, no, absolutely a rural person. As I say, I dallied into Brisbane for a couple of years. Spent all my time, because I was marketing rural Australia, I spent all my time out in the bush. Before that, I lived out at Winton, so I spent a lot of my teenage years in Western Queensland, and apart from boarding school, so very much comfortable with living in the bush. But really aware that it is absolutely, as you say, isolated in different ways, not just geographically. Mm.
Now, Tim Saal is, of course, at the coalface. He's the manager of rural and remote programs at Rural and Remote Mental Health. Tim, what makes you passionate about this topic?
Belinda, again, welcome everybody and thanks for your time today. Primarily, my background is that I grew up on a property halfway between Millmerran and Gundy. I went to boarding school, 12, so I didn't get a lot of experience there, and then ended up running an ag science department in the South Burnett with Education Queensland for a while, and then a little bit over 10 years ago, through various reasons and the drought that some could consider has still continued since then, was really taking a grip, and my current CEO came to me and said, around education and community, would I be interested in coming across? And at that time I did a bit of reflection on family as well as communities I'd lived in and the number of people that we'd lost through suicide, and I thought, well, I'm big enough and ugly enough and I can talk under wet cement, so this is where I'll go. Since then I've literally travelled nearly every back road in Queensland and a lot of the other ones in every other state in Australia, and basically getting out there, starting the conversation, providing community awareness, stigma reduction and education around mental health as well as suicide prevention.
So you have personal experience in terms of people you've known very well that have committed suicide, for example?
Yeah, so growing up in a small town, we had a nucleus of about 8 blokes in the local cricket team who I was the 12th man for from the age of about 6, and 3 of those gentlemen did suicide over the last 15 years. Yeah.
Wow. Pretty high statistic, isn't it? Mm. And Craig Hamilton is one of Australia's leading mental health advocates. He's also a very well-known ABC broadcaster, particularly if you love sport, grandstand. He's an author, he's a motivational speaker. In fact, his books have been celebrated, you would say, throughout the country. He's got a very public personal experience with mental illness. Can you tell me what happened in 2000, Craig?
Yeah, I can. Thank you for having me. Good morning. Great to be here today. You're probably wondering, first of all, what's a broadcaster doing at a rural, regional farmers session? Well, I got a farming background. Start off, I grew up on a dairy farm in Singleton, and so I got a very good, I suppose, background and knowledge of what it's like to live on the land, and saw Dad work 24/7 pretty much without any holidays milking dairy cattle for a long time, so I've got a good understanding there. So then from farming to mining, underground mining for 16 years, then to the ABC, and then the episode of very serious mental health problems in 2000. So we're talking 18 years ago now, where I had an extreme depression for a period of 7 months, and it got to a point where I was suicidal, and I didn't know that I could ever be suicidal. I didn't think I could ever be depressed, that I wouldn't be that type of person. I didn't ever experience those things before. I was 37 years of age, and I had no tools as a male to be able to handle it. And I think that's it's a massive part of the problem, actually, not only the stigma that Tim talked about. We don't have any tools in the kit to deal with that range of emotions when they do hit us between the eyes, particularly in the ages around 30, 40, 50 years of age. So I've had to learn all that afterwards, that toolkit. So the depression happened, and it got more and more serious, and I told no one about it. That was another big mistake. I kept it all, we catch and kill our own Australian men. We've got this pride, this resilience and this ego, if you like, that we will sort it out. And so I tried to do that with no success. And it got extremely serious. As I said, I was suicidal before I actually got help. And then medicated for that, and then had a massive high, a manic episode, a psychosis, and a bipolar 1 diagnosis. So, and for those that don't know bipolar, it's massive highs and lows, extreme mood shifts. And that's what I've been managing since for the last 18 years, and 95% of the time I'm well, very well, and I do a lot of speaking, and 5% of the time I'm not well, and I've got to work at it like anyone with their health. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it was such a public episode, so there was no hiding, was there? Because that incident happened on air.
Well, no, it didn't happen on air, but it happened just prior to the Olympics. So it was, The episode happened 3 days before the start of the Sydney Olympics, and I was getting ready to go and work. And I was in no fit state to work in the midst of this manic episode. But when you're manic, you don't know you're unwell. In fact, it's the opposite. You feel like you're 10 foot tall and bulletproof. You feel fantastic. And no one else knew I was unwell. Because it's very hard to, unless you're really skilled in that area, that the signs and symptoms of mania can be explained away by exuberance and enthusiasm and really out there, I suppose, energy.
Which is fantastic for a broadcaster.
Fantastic for a broadcaster. And also, this guy's off to the Olympics, so why wouldn't he be excited? That could be explained away. But yes, it was public, and I didn't make the train, and then that mania tipped over into psychosis, which is when you lose the grip on reality and you become delusional. So I had the whole experience, and I didn't make it, and I ended up in hospital, which was the best place to be. It was a fantastic place to be when you're that unwell, diagnosed, and therefore that's the beginning of the road back to good health, once you know what you're actually dealing with, and up till that point I didn't.
Mm-hmm. Now, when we talk about rural communities, we're often talking about suicide, and you've talked about suicide as well. And when we talk about suicide, we're talking about depression. But I also want to talk about some of the other mental illness diagnosis, I suppose, that we probably don't talk about enough, because it's not always about depression. I think that we are talking a lot about depression. Don't you agree? That people do talk about depression a lot. But there are so many different types of mental illness. Perhaps there's still that stigma on, for example, bipolar, or on, for example, schizophrenia, which could potentially lead to depression and therefore suicide. But we don't necessarily talk about those in the same way as we talk about depression. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. The mental illness is a broad church. It's a very broad umbrella. So you've got depression is certainly in there, anxiety, acute anxiety is certainly in there, schizophrenia is in there, bipolar 1 is in there, bipolar 2 is in there. Bipolar 2 is the same mood shifts, the same mood swings, the highs and lows, but you don't go as high. You don't have that psychosis. So they're all in there. Acute stress could be put under that umbrella as well. So it's very broad. The serious depression, the clinical depression that leads to suicidal thinking, is the dangerous one, because you reach that point where you're so despairing and the hole is so deep and dark that you think it's the only way out. And when you're in that place, that's where suicides occur, because you need somebody else actually to intervene. And if no one intervenes, then quite often that's what happens. And you're right, there's more suicides in Australia than road deaths every year. That's the size of the problem.
And I think one of the challenges too is that, I look at things like anxiety. I think anxiety is much more common in the bush than we think, and phobias and those sorts of things. But what they often lead to is the depression, and that's the concern, is that they'll lead into the depression. And I think what was fortuitous for you, Craig, is you actually had people around you. And one of the things I believe in the bush is that we don't always have people around us. We're often working alone, and we're working with people who probably excuse behaviour a lot. I think the further west you go, the more people are absolutely... If you're prepared to live in our town or work on our place, we'll put up with some kind of erratic behaviour because we want you to stay here. You're a great mechanic, and we want you to stay in our town because you're a great mechanic. And the fact that you have some really wild mood springs or something happens at work, we'll kind of tolerate that. So, people sort of head west when they're trying to deal with some things. I think because we're actually, sounds a bit bizarre, but I think we're more tolerant often in the bush of people's challenges that they're facing, and we're actually quite understanding that everyone's going through something at some stage. But the concern is that's not picked up, that we actually go, that's okay. That's just Fred. Fred's always like that.
And would you know a few people like that you think, oh, okay, but we've put up
I think it is the noticing concern. So last night they spoke about when particularly young boys start to withdraw. I noticed that. I mean, I've been there. It's the really classic thing. Oh, no, I can't make it. We're just too busy. No, I've got cattle to feed. I've got things to do. No, I'm just toe tied up. It is really easy to step out of life when you live on the land. because no one can actually make you get out there, and except your immediate family or really good friends who physically sort of insist that you be somewhere. So I think that ability of men and women in the bush to actually step out of life means that they can then become more isolated, which then means the voices in your head get a much stronger voice than the people that are around you. So that isolation, I think, plays into and can lead with, just start with postnatal depression or some anxiety or some concerns about things that spirals into depression. And it's very difficult then to, as you say, lift yourself back out of that.
There's this thought, though, that actually, in fact, I remember doing the interview, I can't remember who it was like the Rural Doctors Association or some organisation like that, that was saying that people with, depression or anxiety or some form of mental illness actually do move to quieter places like bush areas because they think that that's their solace. But in fact, it could, depending on the circumstances, make things worse. Would you agree with that, Tim?
Yeah, certainly. Moving into more rural areas, smaller communities, you've got then the stigma of everyone knowing everyone else's business. But as Georgie said, the isolation and the withdrawal is almost facilitated by those small communities because of that increased tolerance. I don't want to be nosy. And the second side of the coin is, and a lot of our communication and education and community is around, how do you actually engage with that person to have that conversation around, look, Fred, you're a great mechanic, but you're up and down all the time. How do you actually have that conversation, which can be extremely confronting both for Fred as well as for you as a concerned member of the community?
How do you?
Quite simply, there's three things to include in that conversation. There's what you've seen, so Fred's erratic behaviour, what you know. Sometimes that erratic behaviour can be symptoms of mental illness or that they're struggling with something. And is there anything I can do to help you around that, Fred? And then if Fred turns around and says, well, yes, I've been struggling with this, I'm crying, I'm drinking too much, I'm all these symptoms, then knowing where to refer that person onto, and that's the critical step. And then we talk about the tyranny of distance and decreased clinical services in rural areas, but with the MBS and telepsych and things like that, there are services available and they're increasing all the time. Ideally, face-to-face would be best, but there are services there. So.
But I remember a friend of mine who committed suicide who worked at the ABC, actually. His name was Paul Boddington. And it was probably 6 or 7 years ago now. And I would never, he was always, and I'm sure you probably have a story a little bit similar to this, he was always someone who was actually really happy and really engaging and really the life of the party, perhaps like Craig was at times. You would never guess that he was sad in any way. So I don't relate at all to what you're saying in terms of erratic behaviour. I saw none of that. I saw him being what he was, which is always happy.
Yep.
And lovely and a good friend and asking me how I was all the time.
So you lived with him for a while?
No.
Well, you only saw the bright side.
Yeah.
And I didn't know Paul Boddington, but I certainly was aware of Paul. I knew who he was and was aware of his story. And I had colleagues that also worked with Paul and who said the same thing. He was really bright, upbeat, outgoing, confident, funny, life of the party guy. And that fits my description as well, absolutely. But, when you're here and you're that person for long enough and you have a mood disorder or a bipolarity, then the downside for that is here. The mood swing is here.
How do you hide that, though? How is he hiding that when you see him every day?
Yes, and I'm a bush psychiatrist, okay? I don't have any letters. I only know what I know, and my own experience is that, and we're not going to get the answers with Paul or with others who have committed suicide because they take them with them, but there's a potential there that there was a mood disorder that hadn't been diagnosed, that there were some really highs and big lows. You don't see, here's the thing with bipolar, you don't see the depressed person because they won't allow you to see them when they're depressed. They won't go out. They'll make those excuses not to go. And it's not that hard. I'm not feeling well, I'm busy, I've got something else on. They don't feel well enough to go. And that was exactly my experience as well. And when the depression lifts and the mood shifts down the track, whether it's a month later, 6 months later, 12 months later, bang, you're back. You're back and you're in the game and you're going to the events and you're back and you're the life of the party. But we all our moods shift. Anyone who thinks they flat line, and I've said this before at many events, you're already dead if you flat line, right? So take it from me, the human experience is like this. It's like the worm, right? Some days we're up, a little bit up, some days a little bit down. And we function quite normally, and that's normal, right? Where it's problematic is where the highs are a bit higher and the lows are a bit lower. And as that increases, you know, bigger highs, bigger lows, bigger highs, bigger lows, until you get to that really top of the roller coaster. And then there's the bottom of the roller coaster. And the shift between those two states is extreme. That's where you're walking in dangerous ground.
I've always thought that my dad had bipolar. He was like that, you know, the life of the party, but he was never diagnosed. I always had this suspicion that he had bipolar. And I remember talking to a GP about it, who happened to be a family friend, and we had this enormous fight because I am a wallflower and don't say what I think at all, ever. So I told her that I thought he may have bipolar because I do interviews like this all the time. And I'm not an expert by any stretch, but a few things sort of pricked my attention, and I thought, there's something going on here. And we had, as a family, he had an office in Brisbane, so he would go down there, and we lived in Mackay, and he would go down, and I was at boarding school anyway at the time, so you'd only see little signs, and I would go into the unit in Brisbane, and I'd find all these books and videos about depression and how to beat it. I thought, that's strange. Like he'd been locked up in a place by himself, watching videos, trying to get himself out of it.
Yeah.
You know, reading anti-depression books and, you know, trying to self-diagnose, really. And he was like that, and everyone who I said, I think there's something wrong, they never saw that. And the doctor had she was a GP, she had an argument, you're accusing him of having a very serious illness. And I said, well, yes, I am actually. But she would not accept it. She would, and she was a GP, would not accept it because I wanted her to talk to him about whether or not that was the case. And she just wouldn't do it. That was really difficult because I asked for medical help and she refused. But she happened to know him pretty well, so maybe that family friend thing got in the way.
It's a tricky one.
Yeah.
I think that the highs and lows sometimes can be noticed. It's the bit before that, Craig, that I think is more difficult, and welcome your insight. So I think it is that when people start to withdraw, that it is how do we actually re-engage, and how do we know that they're not just exhausted and want to stay home, and how is it that they're just saying after work, no, I don't want to stay and catch up with everyone, I'm going. And when that when that sort of start to withdraw, and how you re-engage people or help them move back out from that negativity or wrap something around them. And I think they're the really critical times rurally when we probably look back on things and think, I had a conversation and I probably should have followed that through. I probably should have made sure they turned up to that. And we're non-confrontational on the whole. We don't want to be the person who makes you do something. But it is family that really come back to, and it's your close friends. It's the people that you know their habits day in, day out, and you start to notice changes in their behaviour that I think it's really important we actually try to notice those. Or if we're not close enough, if we see it, that we talk to someone else about it.
And I want to talk about your personal experience. There was a bus driver that you were telling me about. Tell me a little bit about that. Yeah,
so we had a community. We're a pretty tight-knit community because we are an hour from any town. And I can still remember it really clearly because I was at a meeting in Brisbane and I had several messages from my husband, which is unusual. And it was the June long weekend, and he'd left a message saying, you need to go straight to the school. Our eldest was in year 8, and pick Ben up, and I'll talk to you. So our bus driver on the Friday morning had rung emergency services. So both he and his wife are our bus drivers. He's lived his whole life in the district. She grew up half an hour away. So he rang emergency services as his wife left that morning, knowing that she would be an hour, or a bit over an hour. And he suicided. But by the time she got back, emergency services were there, so she didn't find him. But the ramifications for the whole community. So we're not immediate family, but for our children, this is, a daily interaction for them. It's for my husband, it's someone he grew up with. So how do you then, as a community, you're not the grieving family that can gather around, but as a community, it was just so important to gather people. And on Saturday night, we just said to people, 7 o'clock, there's a bonfire at our place, and I think the last people left at 2 or 3 in the morning. We just felt a need that you actually have to gather people around. But you then look back and go, he didn't turn up to this, and that there are bits and pieces that they weren't engaging with. But as a community, you are all impacted, and I think this is the really challenging thing as well in rural communities, is that it isn't. I mean, it's just devastating for the family, but there is a much longer, lifelong ripple effect for a whole community.
How do you wrap around, his wife? Because if I've
amazingly, someone did that Friday bus run with her for years. So friends got on that bus run every Friday morning and did that bus run with her. People still wrap their arms around her. So as a community, because you all feel it, you're all still living it. And that's what I think is the other strength of rural communities, is we're great when things happen. We just need to get better at actually helping them not happen.
So exactly that. The strength of rural communities is that we do know each other's business, and we need to work on that strength and give ourselves, with days like today, permission to actually have that conversation. Notice those changes, have that conversation on almost a daily basis with everyone around how are you tracking and are you okay today is brilliant. It starts the conversation. But what happens if someone says no? So we need to be able to have that conversation.
Just ignore that. I should have turned it off. My apologies. I didn't.
Make it an everyday part of our practice. We're in small communities. We're under pressure because of drought, political decisions, climate. Everything is there. It's stacked against us. But why not look at the positive and use the positive of having a local community, know how to ask that conversation, and if someone says, yeah, I'm feeling shit, where do we get them help? And know where that is. So it's around empowering communities to look after themselves.
Do they say that? Do they say, yeah, I'm not feeling really good?
Yeah.
Or do they do no, I'm feeling great, and then go behind the scenes and do something else?
Two sides to it. And again, this is something that we focus on when we work with communities. The first responsibility is to the individual. And quite often, initially, oh yeah, I feel a bit down today, I feel a bit up tomorrow. And it's that general sort of paddling through life. But you've got to be honest to yourself. Your harshest critic is the person that looks back at you every morning when you wash your face in the mirror. You've got to be honest with yourself with how you're travelling, and if you're struggling, stick your hand up and ask help. And it's difficult. It's the hardest step you'll take, but it's the most critical one. And then around that individual, we've got to have a community that are also looking out for each other. Australians pride ourselves on mateship. This, to me, would be the crux of what mateship is. Being able to see someone who's struggling, have the confidence and the knowledge and the understanding to walk up and have a conversation with them. And if they turn around and say, yeah, I am thinking about killing myself. All right, where do we get help? How do we get help? And have that knowledge.
Let's talk about the rural issues that are out of farmers' control that can impact on their mental health. Drought, flood, bushfire. And of course, climate challenges, we're told, will become more severe in the future. So how, therefore, do you meet that challenge knowing that it's not going away and you don't necessarily have any control individually over that? Tim.
Oh, thanks. One of my favourite comments is someone far smarter than me's worked on this far longer than me and they didn't come up with a solution either. But look, it's why we do what we do and why we love living in the bush, because we understand that there is that variability. We accept the challenge. We don't always like the challenge, but we understand that there are things out of our control, and that's part of the education and awareness as primary producers or the local mechanic in rural towns. We live and work in harsh conditions that are changing that we don't have a lot of control over. So as far as mental health, that's putting us on an unsteady footing for a start. But what we need to do is realise that we are also the leaders in innovation and productivity in the world as far as primary producers. So we've got to get creative as a community and as an industry to work out how we can deal with this, because it doesn't matter about climate change or the latest tractor or stump jump plough or whatever you've got, the latest genetics in your beef line, unless you're there front and centre as the primary producer, the human in the centre, nothing else happens. Your dog can't drive the tractor. So you've got to look after your first asset. Your primary asset is the individuals.
But Georgie, I'm going to go back to Georgie on this. I mentioned this earlier, that all of that innovation that we're talking about, which is fantastic, by the way, and will be the future. It is indeed the future of farming in Australia. It does accentuate isolation, because more innovation means less people around, potentially.
It does. I mean, I'm really interested to see how connectivity has changed some of the isolation, and I kind of lived through that. I had 2 children within 12 months. It's a really good first birthday present to give your child a sibling. But that led to a whole lot of challenges, and around about the same time, we had some foreclosure in the family, we had a suicide in the family, there was a whole range of other things that were happening alongside 2 very small children that, need your care. We got the internet when they were about 6 months and 18 months old, and I found that just a whole new world out there. I used to get excited when you got 1 or 2 emails a day. Now I just don't want to check the emails. But I really see now the challenges that I faced in 95 to 2000 are actually, we have tools to diminish that isolation. It actually, for me, that is probably where I see some of the really positive things of connectivity, is the checking in. Yes, there'll be isolation, but there's actually a better chance to be able to stay in touch with people. And I actually see that happening where people are checking in on each other on social media, which I find the tweets from the tractor cab guys, they chat a lot and they check in on each other to say, and I've had private messages where I've been let know that someone's not coping at the moment, and we've been talking offline, and so I think we absolutely do have the isolation, but even when we had people there, people weren't noticing the changes. So I think the connectivity, and I see for young women particularly, there are a lot of young women. I'm fortunate. I grew up in the bush. I grew up in isolation. I actually love being out. That's my happy place, is to be out there with some cattle and in the paddock. But that's not the same for all women, and they fall in love and they don't realise the isolation they're going to be facing. So I'm just delighted to see the supportive nature of a lot of the communities that have emerged online to support young families in what they're trying to navigate and when they hit roadblocks, and a more genuine kindness about accepting people that they actually are having a struggle at the moment and I need you to support me. And I'm not sure that was around in the 90s particularly, when I was going through that period. There wasn't an understanding that we might actually be struggling. I remember having these 2 children and thought that might actually be useful for me to actually have some contraception. So I actually went on the mini pill because, didn't really need 3 in 3 years. But I remember saying that to the doctor because I'd then been online and I'd read a bit about the side effects. And I said to my GP, do you think there's any sort of reality about this side effect of the mini pill with postnatal depression? No, that's rubbish. So was ever that mate, I'm just struggling a little bit here, but was dismissed immediately. So went through my own research and own processes and learned how to cope with that. But I think that's the thing, we're much more attuned to this, but we need to keep having the conversation so that we do pick up the small signs. I don't think I'll come today, just feeling a bit flat. Why are you feeling a bit flat? Let's have a talk about that. Are you in such a rush that you can't stop and have a talk? So I think the small signs have been there before, but no one knew how to pick them up. People like Craig have written about it, they go and talk about it, they've raised the awareness about it. But I think for all the reasons that social media gets beat up, and I'm so pleased it wasn't around when I was a teenager, it was bad enough in boarding school without social media at the time. I think there were some real positive sides, and I'm seeing, even during the drought, I'm seeing people share their stories, staying in touch with a young woman out at north of Broken Hill. They're doing 26 feed runs a day or something, but she regularly videos the feed run. So we're on the feed run with her and we're listening to her music and we're chatting about it and she's getting some support. But she couldn't have done that 20 years ago. So that
it certainly is a positive
use
thing.
Those things.
There's no doubt about that. But there is research now that you see just recently came out this week, of course, as a result of Mental Health Awareness Day today. And it was about the fact that young people are struggling with social media, and I've seen it, that you see, and it would happen in rural communities just as much as anywhere else, where they paint this picture that looks very glamorous and lovely and their lives are perfect, but it's actually it may well be hiding something. Now, Craig, I want to ask you, obviously mental illness can be a lifelong battle depending on what the diagnosis is. It's something that you have to be aware of all the time. So how do you, put in the mix, drought, flood, things, you know, that might happen in your life, you know, a death in the family, you know, stress, financial stress, whatever it might be, that might not necessarily be in your control.
Well, that's one of the big, you know, that's life, isn't it? You know, once we accept there's so much in our lives that is out of control, we're a hell of a lot happier, I think, because, you know, it's almost like you've got to hand it over. Life is what happens when you're making other plans, and that was what John Lennon said it, he was right, and that was my experience too. So once my point is there, if we stew on and, you know, focus on and live every day about all the things and worry about things we can't control, that's all we'll do, is worry. So, you know, when it comes to if you're on the land, I know, and I've been out a couple of times with Tim, and we've gone out. I've been in some remote communities in Queensland. I've been up here. I've been to places in Queensland that there's a lot of Queenslanders who've lived here all their lives have never heard of. You know, places like Georgetown and Greenvale, right out in the middle. Been out there, and the first, you know, be in the middle of drought, and there's mental health issues, there's depression issues in the town. There might have been a couple of suicides in the town in the last 12 months. And the first thing I say when I get this, I can't make it rain. That's the first thing I say. Cannot make it rain. But what I can tell you is the signs and symptoms that you might be depressed, the signs and symptoms that you might be going through an episode here, and tell you that if with treatment and with intervention, might be medication, it could be, for some people, it could be, you know, seeing someone, and I know that's problematic because of the isolation, then things can change. Now for me, bipolar is something that's got to be managed. There's no doubt about that. I cannot be complacent with bipolar disorder. You mentioned the books that I've written, and I think they have some here. The first one talks about that initial episode on the train station. All right? That's where I had a psychotic episode and was diagnosed. I then went 7 years without incident. I was medicated the right way and life was fine. But I've been hospitalised 4 other times since then. And that's why the second book was written, because I think there was a perception there that Craig's well. He's been diagnosed with bipolar, he's got his medication right, we hear him on the radio, he's speaking in a lot of places, telling his story, he's good, he's fine all the time, which is not the truth. There's been 4 other hospital admissions, every time with mania, always with highs, I've never been hospitalised with depression, but depression always follows. So I know now the challenge for me is to manage the high with bipolar.
What is mania? Explain what exactly that is.
Well, mania is when you're running at 1,000,000 miles an hour. You're running fast. You have huge amounts of energy. You have a lot of ideas. You only want to hear your own voice. You're not prepared to listen to anyone else. You can be reckless in your decision making and in your behaviour. You can make decisions that you'll regret later. Things like spending, you can overspend when you're manic. You can book holidays that you don't need when you're manic. You can buy properties you don't want when you're manic, buy a car, relationship change that, you know, 6 months ago the relationship was fine. When you're manic, it's not so good, I'm out of here. That's sort of those big life decisions when you're manic, that 6 months later when you're not manic you go, what the hell have I done? That can be mania, and at the whole time when you're manic you don't think it's a problem, and that's why it's tricky. That's why it's really tricky. Yeah.
Now, if you'd like to ask any questions, feel free. Are there any questions?
Right.
Don't be shy.
What was there a trigger? Do you remember back? Was there a trigger that caused your first episode?
Well,
can you think back at what it could have been, or?
I get asked that a lot. Was there a trigger to this episode? Now, you don't need something with bipolar. It doesn't have to be a bad experience to trigger an episode of bipolar or a mania or a psychotic episode. It can be something you perceive as a good experience, an exciting experience, something you're really looking forward to and getting really up for, which was, for me, was the Olympics. The mood swings that I've described that happened in 2000, I've actually had all my life. but I didn't realise it till I looked backwards. Those highs and lows were there through my teenage years. And there'd be times when I would, as a teenager, feel $1 million and be the life of the party. And there were also times when I'd feel withdrawn and I'd feel socially isolated and I'd feel depressed. But at the time I didn't know it, but now I can look back. So those mood swings have always been there, which is the nature. I was just a late onset of diagnosis, I suppose, in my mid-30s. There's a huge genetic factor here. There's a huge genetic factor with bipolarity. It's in your DNA. I got it on both sides. I have bipolarity on one side and garden variety depression, if you like, on the other side. So it's a perfect storm genetically, and then if the right things are in place, the right stressors are in place, and by the time you're 30, married, mortgage, children, job, pressure, lifestyle, bad lifestyle choices, all those things can factor into a situation which is already volatile, and then you have an episode. Yeah. Best way I could answer that.
Megan? Yeah.
Oh, brilliant discussion. I think I especially loved the conversation around how in the bush people with eccentricities are almost encouraged, aren't they? Oh, that's just sort of lucky old Joe, but Tim, you were saying about, picking up on the conversation and making sure that you're offering services. I mean, even for me as a sort of educated person, I don't really know where to say to people, we all go, I'll go and see your GP, but,
What else is there? Yep. So there's several really good resources that are out there. Obviously, the Big Blue Butterfly, Beyond Blue, does a lot of really high quality resources. A lot of the trouble that we face in rural and regional areas is the 12-month funding scheme. So by the time you recruit to a position, someone's in a position of providing counselling or services in a community for probably 6 months, and then doing an exit strategy, then they're changing the shirt because the next provider in town has picked up that contract. So that continuity of service in communities is something that we're advocating very strongly for at a federal level. It makes it very difficult for trust, which is one of the biggest things around people accessing services in the bush. But also to get back to your original question around where do we go, how do we know, there are quite a few online documents, and a lot of local government associations will have those up on their websites. And more now with the standardisation of the primary health networks federally funded, they are recording referral pathways and processes through that. So there are ways there, but again, until you actually have a conversation like we're having here, Joe blogs on the street, they don't get informed about this through community education at high school or as they're going through. So how do people actually get engaged with this at an early stage before they need that critical clinical intervention? That's where we have to focus. It's a community issue, suicide and mental illness, so it needs a community response. And that's where education campaigns, anti-stigma campaigns, making people aware of where to get that help before they need it. It's critical.
And I think too, the other thing is as leaders in our communities, trying to make sure those resources are actually available in terms of, it's going to be different in every community as to what's available, because I'm with Tim, constantly frustrated by the episodic nature of the funding around mental health in particularly regional communities. So it really does come down to where is that person and what sort of services are going to suit them. I actually know some people where the tele-psychiatry has actually been much more effective for them than face-to-face. And certainly services out of Longreach and things are using that really effectively. So I think it's about having those resources available in workplaces and at community functions, and about engaging people who can have those conversations. So the Royal Flying Doctor Service, the Drought Wellbeing Service, we try and make sure they're at field days where people are going to have those sorts of conversations or talk about some of the things, or they can ask the questions and they're trusted. So I think it's also about making sure if we're holding events that we make sure there's someone there who can have those sorts of conversations, that we make the material available, that it's on websites, that we have these conversations as well.
Did anything change in terms of that, making sure things were available after that event after the bus driver?
Oh, there's been plenty of things in our community, and actually the men in our community have, for a few years after that, used to get together once a year and have a conversation about those things and make sure there were a psych bearer and those sorts of things. But I think it's an ongoing conversation. I mean, it's the bit Craig says, understanding what you can't control. I mean, I'm a complete control freak, and back in my early days, it was like, here's my year's plan and don't deviate, and my year will not be successful if I haven't done I'm married to someone who just goes, well, you tell me when it's going to rain and I'll tell you what I'm doing. And I've learned a lot from that we've actually got to roll with the punches. We've got to find the joy in every day. It's a choice we make to find the joy in every day and to help others. And I think that's the thing. When other people aren't finding the joy in every day, why isn't it? We're amazingly blessed in this country with the resources we have and all those sorts of things. And if it's just I'm tired and I'm exhausted and there's a few issues, well, that's fine. But if there's a bigger systemic thing, you can have that conversation. But it's when people actually, don't want to find the joy in the day, that's when you can have the conversation.
I'm going to ask that question to all of you. What's the joy in your day, Craig?
The joy in my day is I love what I do. I love what I do. In fact, if somebody turned around tomorrow and said, what's your dream job? I'd say the one I'm doing. There's nothing else I'd rather do. And for a long time that wasn't the case. I knew I didn't want to be a dairy farmer because I'd seen Dad work 7 days a week, and I thought, no, I don't want to work 7 days a week. And then I went coal mining because it was the only job that was going at the time, and there was a coal boom on, so I applied for a job. I was doing my HSC. I had no idea what I wanted to do. I worked at that for 16 years, and it didn't make my heart sing. It didn't make my soul sing. It didn't float my boat, but broadcasting does. And the moment I got the first time behind a microphone, I loved it, and I love this stuff. I love the speaking and meeting people, and that's the joy, and staying well and looking after myself. Because if I'm well, everyone else in my world, their lives change for the better. It's when I'm not well, that's where it gets problematic.
What's the joy in every day for you? Or give me some examples of what joy might be for you.
Oh, look, I'm a bit like Craig. I feel like I'm just living the dream gig in terms of I get to live on a property, but I get to work with some extraordinary organisations on their boards and some great people. But I mean, I pulled up on the way back from Lismore yesterday because it was just such a cracker view. I'd been on the phone and it just the mountain came up in front of me, and I just sort of stopped and actually just sat there and looked at it and took a photo for my daughter who's up here in the Kimberleys. It's just more contrast I couldn't have got from the Great Dividing Range. But I think it's literally that. It's like opening your eyes and seeing that it is a stunning day, or in our case, appreciating when it's a rainy day. But it's just those little bits. It's not even the really big, huge moments. It's the little pieces of joy, and literally just sitting on the veranda and enjoying the birds and the sun and the sunshine in the morning, and finding that each day.
Tim?
2 things. One's professionally. So in over 10 years, I know that there's at least 24 blokes who are here that wouldn't have been otherwise, including 6 from our road shows that we did. Including one bloke that went out to Queensland Health the next morning with his suicide note. I slid that over the counter and said, I need your help to stop me doing this. And that was because of Craig and John were there telling their story and encouraging people to help. So personally, from a professional perspective, what I do and helping people to have that conversation and save those lives, because we're losing too many good people in the bush. And personally, it's obviously family. So a wife and 3 terrorist boys. And no matter where I am around Australia, every night even if I'm in meetings, I excuse myself to FaceTime with them, and that's not negotiable. Mm-hmm. So that's
I have the quote of the day with my children. It always makes you laugh when you've got young children, or quotes of the day. That's my joy. One final question, perhaps, before we.
How did the children cope with the bus driver incident? Like, do they get educated on suicide? Because they grow up with you guys. You're a role model. Do they get educated on mental health?
They know what happened. And I think, our children at that stage were aged probably 5 to 12, so challenging for the younger ones to absorb that. But there's been no. I guess that's the other thing. We actually have that open conversation to say, yeah, that Graham's suicide. He didn't just die. He didn't just go away. Belinda finds joy with her phone, I reckon.
I do actually enjoy that.
At least everyone else can laugh.
Stay away from the cookie jar, I think I heard before. Is that the one? No.
Something like
Sounds
sorry.
like it.
Sorry,
Fine. But I think it's really important for our kids to have these honest conversations. Yeah. And one of the things I'd like to say is suicide's a permanent solution to a temporary problem. and to actually have that conversation with them. There are times you are going to feel really flat about things, and certainly with a 17-year-old daughter, I mean, there's been, but you don't even, these are temporary issues that we need to work through, and I think that the conversation, so for me it's about having ongoing conversation with children and the wider village as well. We've got quite a strong village in our community, and that to me is important as well, that sometimes kids will have the conversation with other significant adults in their life, particularly teenagers. So I really value being able to be there for someone else's children, knowing that my children will probably go and talk to someone else and not feeling, I don't feel offended about that. I actually see that's the richness of our intergenerational multifamily communities.
And there's one final question that a lady up the back wanted to ask. Yep.
I was just going to say, you know, I moved from Brisbane to Nanango, so to a rural area, and from the medical help that I was getting in Brisbane to where I am now, I mean, if I was admitted to hospital after 5:30 on a Friday, I couldn't see a doctor until 9 o'clock on a Monday. And that's how it's like at the hospital. There's nobody there to be able to prescribe me the medications that I need for that period of time. And there just seems to be a big missing link for those in rural areas to get the help that they need when they need it.
Yeah.
Tim, is there any answer to that? Maybe you're the best person to answer.
Is there an answer? How big's the bucket of money? Unfortunately, that's what it comes back down to: population density and also votes on the ground. They're extremely large geographical seats as opposed to the tighter urban seats for members of parliament. So therefore, that we haven't got the strength or the voice for that, unfortunately. Again, it's one of those, the good and the bad is that in Nanango in particular, I know that there's a fairly small group of communities in the South Burnett where I don't think you'd even get to see a GP if you went to Kingaroy rather than Nanango. So being close to friends and family would be a higher priority than going over to Kingaroy where you're not going to see a GP anyway. Unfortunately, there is no easy fix for this. And as we've mentioned, mental illness is an individual thing. It doesn't work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, unfortunately. It'd be really easy if we could. Resources would go far further. So while it is an extremely unfortunate circumstance, there's not a lot that we can do about that at this stage. Again, talking about the tele-psych earlier, and one of the other things that I do in my spare time is I manage a program called Partners in Recovery, and we've got people out in the Western Downs who use tele-psych through to a Gold Coast-based company. And the systems that they operate under are slightly different to a normal practice in the way that they have changed their operation to suit virtual clients, basically. So they have checks and balances in place around when scripts should end. So they're actually contacting the client ahead of time. Whereas a normal practice, generally speaking, don't do that. It's up to the client, the onus is on the client. So there are advancements, there are advantages, but also there are disadvantages as well. And we've got to sort of take the good with the bad and try and improve the bad and enjoy the good while it works.
Now, while my phone ringing has made people laugh, it does make people laugh. I do look for weird phone rings. I do definitely do that, Craig, because it makes people laugh. We are making some of the organisers anxious, so I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you, Belinda, and thank you for your attendance today.
Thank you very much, Georgie.
Thanks, Belinda. It's been a
And
pleasure.
thank you very much, Craig.
Pleasure. Thank you for coming.